Residents at Brightview Senior Living Communities enjoy enhanced possibilities, independence, and choice. Brightview Dulles Corner in Herndon and Brightview, Great Falls, offer vibrant senior independent living, assisted living, and memory care services through various daily programs and cultural events. Chef-prepared meals, safety and security, transportation, resort-style amenities, and high-quality care. Everything you need is here. Discover more at brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal housing opportunity.
Welcome to episode number 286 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Carolina Brock, LH, and EJ. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is The Conjuring Last Rites. The Conjuring Last Rites was released in 2025. It has 6.5 out of 10 on IMDb and 57% on Rotten Tomatoes. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren take on one last terrifying case involving mysterious entities that they must confront. Now, as always with these film reviews, I have split into likes and dislikes, and we're going to start with the likes. And the first thing I'm going to say is that there's lots of immediate scares in this film, right? We are straight in. We're straight in with scares. We're straight in with big scares, big jumps, and they continue throughout. We're going with the scares. We're not kind of easing into this story. We're immediately going, this is what this film is about. This is where we're going. Boom, right? And bizarrely, the second thing I wrote down, because I was taking notes when I was watching this, I also watched this film at like 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I kind of have this like secret love for watching horror films at inappropriate times of the day, like first thing in the morning, going to the cinema at 12 o'clock in the afternoon to watch a big budget horror film. That is my vibe. And the second thing that I wrote down was right, honestly, the scariest thing in the whole film was the garbage disposal unit. I find them absolutely insane. I need some Americans to chime in here, right? We do not have those garbage disposal units in our sinks here in the UK. At least I've never seen one before in my life. And there is this moment with like a garbage disposal unit. I think that's what they're called when they're in sinks. And I genuinely was like, those things are wild. Like, is it really just blades? Like a unit of blades in your plug hole? I could really Google this and figure it out. But I'm not going to do that. Is it just blades in your plug hole? You push a button and they like chop up whatever you put down your sink. Is that what they are? If so, then I can only assume there are countless garbage disposal sink unit injuries presenting at A&E every year, because it's like a blender. It's like a blender in your sink. And of course, the minute it gets blocked, you're going to think, I'm going to stick my hand down there. Anyway, that's an aside. That's not really a like or a dislike. It's just a moment of commentary. I do think that this film is quite sentimental, right? And I am not a fan of the Warrens for reasons that I will get into. They are portrayed as a deeply loving couple, right? Who also want what's best for their daughter. And that's quite sweet. You see Ed Warren being particularly clumsy about wanting what's best for his daughter, not in a bad way. And there's a whole backstory of Judy, their daughter, and her fiance Tony. And you know what? It's nice, right? I will say that if you're not into anything sentimental, you'll probably find all those bits that they seem to be quite protracted. They take quite a while. They take up a lot of the story in the film, I will say. I did think it was quite nice that they brought Tony into the fold, because as far as I'm aware, in real life, Tony took over the haunted museum. And the other thing I appreciated is, I mean, I know the story of the Smurl family haunting, which obviously we're going to dive into in this episode. And they did include bits of the Smurl family haunting that are true to life. I will say that 99% of what is portrayed in this film is not real, as in it is not true to the story, but they did include little bits and pieces that were true to the story, and I thought, you know what, fine, like we can get on board with that. And I do think the Smurl family haunting is a very interesting story, so I appreciated that they picked that as the story to end the franchise on, and I do think the franchise needs to come to an end, but that's just me. The other thing that I thought, okay, right, I can see why you did that. And I appreciate it. I mean, it's still not great. As I said, the Warrens were incredibly problematic people. But they did reference the fact that the Warrens were controversial figures in the credits of the film. You know, they said that the Warrens were controversial in life and continue to be controversial, but they did massively impact the community of paranormal investigation. Whether or not you think that's for good or for bad, I mean, that's your own decision, right? In terms of dislikes, there really is no subtlety in these films. Like, the Conjuring film, the first one, I thought was great. And I thought it was really scary. And there was a lot of quiet terror in those films. And there were lots of anxiety-inducing moments. But this film, the scares are big, they are bawdy, and it's not really my vibe. I can imagine that if you were watching this film with a group of friends at Halloween and having a few drinks and having a bit of a skit and a laugh, you might have a good time. But there's no subtlety in it. There's no room to really think in this film. It is just, we're going to hit you with bam, 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 scare after scare. And here are the Warrens being the most loved up paranormal couple, and everyone is rooting for them. And like I said previously, like, I understand why people are rooting for them. You know, the actors that play the Warrens in the Conjuring franchise are very charismatic actors to watch. They portray this relationship very well. It seems like a lovely, loving relationship. And it is the ultimate good versus evil, right? You are watching this pair of people who are the bastion of light and positivity and goodliness and godliness, and then you are pitting them against the ultimate evil, and everyone's on board and you're rooting for them to win, right? So I do understand that, but I did think there were elements of this film that were incredibly triggering. And like I said, the opening sequence really, I mean, it hits hard. And I am really going to recommend to people, when you are watching this film, if you decide to watch it, to do a doesthedogdie.com search of this film before you watch it. And I'm just going to say, this isn't really a spoiler. If, you know, seeing people hanging is difficult for you, then this isn't the film for you, because it happens numerous times throughout the film. If stillborn babies are going to be difficult for you, then I would tread carefully. You know, that gives nothing away. It's just the first 10 minutes. But I found watching those elements quite difficult, particularly the stillborn baby. And I understand that we see the Warrens as the very epitome of good and we need to see them like that, etc. But I found it really difficult watching a stillborn baby being brought back by the power of prayer in a horror film in 2025. It felt really crass, and I understood why they did it in terms of the story, but it was unnecessary and feeds into this strange hero worship of the Warrens. And I did find it deeply problematic to portray the Warrens as being, you know, so connected to God in some way that they could bring their child back with prayer. I found that incredibly difficult, particularly if you spend time reading about the life of the Warrens, particularly Ed Warren. And I understand that it is a fictional portrayal of two people that is designed to be entertaining in a Hollywood fashion. I understand that completely. But I do think that the way that the Warrens have been portrayed in these films has given a false narrative surrounding paranormal investigation and what happens on paranormal investigations, but also surrounding their character and nature in itself, right? Obviously, this is all my opinion. It is completely and utterly my opinion. And in terms of the actual story of the Smurl family haunting, right, I did think it was quite convoluted at times. I thought they tried to fit a lot into the narrative. And listen, when you're a bazillion-dollar budget Hollywood horror film, your CGI cannot be bad. And the CGI in this film was actively bad at times. And really, I was not impressed. I think I'm going to give this film a 2 out of 5. Because it's not that it's not entertaining. And I obviously have a lot of strong opinions about the Warrens. And I was aware of the Smurl family haunting. But is it at its core like a decent story? Yes. Is it entertaining? Yes. There are good jump scares if that's your thing. It would be a good film to watch with friends. But it is a 2 out of 5 for me.
Ever wonder why you have insurance for your car or home, but not your digital life? Meet Webroot Total Protection, your digital bodyguard that is built for real life. Webroot takes the guessing game out of cybersecurity so you can confidently browse, bank, and be yourself online without the worry of hackers lurking around the corner. With Webroot Total Protection, you get antivirus that scans 6 times faster and takes up 33 times less space than the other guys. Identity protection with up to $1 million in fraud expense reimbursement and 24/7 US-based customer support. VPN protection that hides your IP address, personal data, and location from hackers. And cloud backup with unlimited storage that works automatically in the background. With plans for individuals and families, Webroot makes it easy to live a better digital life. Go to webroot.com/promo and get 50% off today. That's webroot.com/promo to get 50% off today. Live a better digital life with Webroot, because peace of mind shouldn't be optional.
Which very quickly brings us to our story this week. Now, all of the research for this story came from a book called The Haunted by Robert Curran with Jack and Janet Smurl. And this book was written sort of pretty much, I think, while the Smurls were essentially still living in the house, with the encouragement of Ed and Lorraine Warren, as far as I'm aware. And I wanted to do this story because obviously it is currently very popular in the zeitgeist. People are talking about the Smurl family haunting. They want to know what elements of it from the film are real and what elements are, exaggerated for cinema purposes. And here's the thing, right? I looked at this story and like I said, I was aware of this story and I sort of thought, why have I never covered this story before? Because I feel like this is a story I should have covered and I don't understand why I didn't. And then when I got into the story, I realised why this is a story that I had avoided. And I will talk about that in more detail in the kind of post-discussion of this story. And if you're new around here because you've looked up the Smurl family haunting and you've ended up here, I will present a narrative of the story as it was apparently told to Robert Curran, with the encouragement of Ed and Lorraine Warren, and we will discuss what my thoughts are on this afterwards. But I would like to give a trigger warning before we get into this story, and I don't often do this, but I am going to talk in this episode about sexual assault, and I am going to briefly mention the dog in this house being hurt. However, I have made those events in the narrative very simple, essentially one-line explorations of what happened because I didn't want to go into loads of detail about them, and I will talk about them when we are dissecting this story. So with all that being said, let's get into it. Fundamentally, this is the story of a failed exorcism. We hear stories of good versus evil, how light always prevails. The heroic priest enters and with liberal splashes of holy water rids a family of a troublesome spirit. It is my belief that much of what we think we know of exorcism comes directly from the film The Exorcist. And the reality of exorcism is much, much different. It's much quieter and much more prolonged. It is not the spinning heads, vomit, and people being hurled through windows, much as Hollywood would like us to believe. I retain a level of skepticism when the Warrens are involved in any story. But what I'm going to outline to you today is the story of the Smurl family as told by the family themselves and by the people who witnessed the phenomena in this household. Regardless of whether you hear this story and believe that these people were harassed by a demon, or whether you hear this story and think that they were the perpetrators of an elaborate hoax for fame and notoriety, something happened to that family. Something that was both devastating and life-changing. The house on Chase Street had been built in the 1890s and had had several owners before the Smurl family moved in. There had always been rumours about the house. There were stories of ungodly noises coming from the house when it was empty. It was a place where you did not let your children play, lest they see something otherworldly through the windows. The house emitted an eerie feeling of unease. John and Mary Smurl lived with their son Jack and his wife Janet, and Jack and Janet's 4 girls, and their dog Simon. Jack Smurl had worked in the Navy as a neuropsychiatric technician, which meant that he assisted on electroshock therapy. Jack and Janet Smurl met at their work Christmas party in 1967. A few years after they were married, the Smurl clan moved into Chase Street, and what was a happy and bustling home. If the events had not unfolded the way they did, the Smurls probably would have forgotten about seemingly insignificant instances. But as always in these stories, hindsight is a very powerful thing. A rug they bought would develop a large, round grease stain no matter how many times it was cleaned to perfection, and they could never figure out how it was happening. The TV burst into flames, which alone could be considered a freak accident, but brand new electrical items around the house and the wiring in Jack's new car also burst into flames. There were constant plumbing problems that just could not be rectified. They replaced the bathroom only to wake up and find that the fittings had been scratched beyond repair, looking almost like the scratches had been done by huge talons or claws. This happened almost every time any DIY was done around the house. One of Jack and Janet's older daughters, Dawn, began to complain of seeing people in her room at night time. Toilets would flush, radios turned on at full blast even though they weren't plugged in. Jack would hear footsteps around the house when no one else was home. And then, by 1983, they began to notice a smell. A foul sulfuric odour that they could find no reason for. It was Janet who had the first experience in the basement. It was the middle of the day, and she was in the basement doing laundry and thinking about beginning to prepare dinner for the family. When she heard it, she had the immediate sense that it was real, and she was not alone in the basement. She did not think that she was imagining things or that it was some sort of auditory misidentification. She heard a woman's voice, soft and eerie, calling out her name. Janet. She heard it multiple times, and her blood ran cold. Janet. Someone else was in the basement with her, but scanning the room she could see no one. She ascended the basement stairs backwards, not daring to take her eyes off the room in case someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to turn her back. Until she heard her name being called from deep within the basement one last time.
Janet.
And she turned and bolted up to her bedroom. By now, the Smurls were growing increasingly concerned. Janet's name being called happened in broad daylight, while she was doing her standard household chores. Jack's parents, who lived on one side of the duplex, had been horrified to hear loud, obscene and disgusting language coming from the other side of the duplex, which Janet and Jack insisted was not them or any of their children. The house had been plunged into a bitter, icy cold, despite the fact that the heating system was working perfectly fine. It was Janet again that would come face to face with this entity for the first time. She was doing the ironing, and the first thing she noticed was the sharp dip in the temperature. It was cold. Very, very cold. And there was no flurry of activity to announce its arrival, just an odd smell. Not foul or sulfuric, just odd. She looked up and there it was. A figure. A dark humanoid mass with what seemed to be a cape billowing behind it. It glided across the floor and in front of the fridge, which allowed Janet to estimate its height to be approximately 5'9". It was smoky, dense, but vaguely transparent. It passed in front of her and Janet stood frozen to the spot, not screaming, not crying out, just frozen. The thing passed through the wall and Janet fled to her in-laws' side of the duplex. She sat down with Mary, her mother-in-law, with whom she had a great relationship, and she had no idea how to tell her what had just happened. As Janet lit a cigarette, it was Mary who spoke first. "Janet, there's something I need to tell you, and I don't know if you are going to believe me. I was sitting here, saying my novenas just now, and I felt something, a presence in the room. I looked up and this dark, shadowy thing came through the wall and went past the staircase down the hallway." Janet was so shocked, but also so relieved, that her first instinct was to burst out laughing. On the morning of Kim's confirmation, the kitchen was heaving while everyone was getting ready, when suddenly it was filled with a tearing sound. The large, long strip light above the table crashed down, striking one of the twins, Shannon, on the shoulder. Jack and Janet realised that whatever was haunting their house was actively trying to hurt them, and they could not allow their children to be at risk. At this point, they just wanted to get out of the house, so they decided to go camping for the weekend. Neighbours reported blood-curdling screams coming from inside the house, and the sound of something flapping against one of the upstairs windows, like the wings of a giant bird. One of the neighbours said, "I've never heard anybody scream as they were dying, but I imagine that the sound I heard coming from the Smurls' home must sound very much like that." And when they returned from their holiday, it was Jack's turn to be in the crosshairs of this haunting. The rest of the family were out, as the girls needed new uniforms. It was 7 p.m. and Jack decided to retire to bed and read a book. He fell asleep quickly, and when he awoke he knew something was wrong. He had a sensation of floating. In his dreams he regularly felt as though he was falling, but this was different. He opened his eyes and realised that not only was he not dreaming, but that he was levitating 2 feet above the bed. He panicked and began to flail around, desperately hoping for gravity to kick in, and he felt this thing, this entity, hurl him with great force back onto the bed. The move to physical attacks was not a one-off incident. One night, while Janet was lying in bed in Jack's arms, she felt a pressure wrap around her leg, and without any warning she was dragged forcibly from the bed. She screamed and clung to Jack, who tried to hold on to her as she kicked her other leg to try and break free from the invisible force that was seemingly intent on dragging her away from the sanctity of their bedroom. Jack was suddenly pinned to the bed, no longer able to hold on to Janet, when suddenly the pressure around her leg relinquished, and she was free. Jack began to move around on the bed, and the entity, for whatever reason, was no longer holding on to them. Was it simply an exercise in fear, or an exercise in dominance and power? They didn't know. But what they did know was that an incessant knocking and banging quickly followed this incident, as well as a foul smell. It was a smell that was strong enough to fill the room and make Janet and Jack retch and gag. They fled their bedroom, their sanctity, their place of safety. It wasn't just Jack and Janet that were at the receiving end of the torment. The family dog Simon was picked up and thrown against the kitchen door one time, and it was believed that the entity had the ability to attack him. Mary Smurl witnessed a shadow creature on 4 legs about the size of a puppy running underneath the sofa. The children witnessed pots and pans flying around of their own volition. They heard clawing and scratching at the walls. They regularly heard the sound of fluttering wings, as though huge birds were taking flight. One of the twins, Shannon, was thrown down the stairs in the middle of the night. The children heard the hissing of snakes, and a bedspread was ripped to shreds. Janet and Jack witnessed their bedroom fill with a strange mist at night time that formed the shape of a person and disappeared into their closet. Eventually their case became known to Ed and Lorraine Warren, who arrived to the house and told them that there were 4 spirits present. An older woman who was harmless, an insane younger woman who was capable of great violence, an aggressive man, and finally, a demon. The Warrens did an initial cleansing of the house and warned Jack and Janet that things may get worse. And they did. The nights in the Smurl household were infiltrated by booming knocks that shook the house. Disconnected TV sets would glow. Jack and Janet were attacked and slapped. It was torture. The Smurls attempted to communicate with the demon by using a 1 knock for yes and 2 knock for no system, and established that this entity meant to harm them. Jack Smurl witnessed women who emitted the same eerie glow as the television set in his bedroom at night time. What happened next is something that I have refrained from talking about on the podcast for various reasons, but I will discuss it further in the analysis of this story. Jack Smurl reported that he was visited by an older woman in the night who was pale-skinned and scaly with red eyes. He was paralysed in bed, and this entity straddled him and had raped him. When he was finally able to move and the entity had disappeared, he went to the kitchen and told Janet what had happened. At breakfast, Dawn, his daughter, told him that she had had a dream where an entity was having sex with him. Ed Warren explained to him that this was a succubus. An exorcism was performed in the house, and the sound of a child wailing and screaming in temper was heard upstairs during it. It eventually ceased, and the house became calm and quiet, and there was a distinct smell of roses. But in the days that followed, the entity returned. Knocks, banging, the smell of raw sewage. And Dawn reported seeing her earrings rise up from her dressing table and fly past her. The exorcism had not been a success. Ultimately, the entity was too powerful, and the family were subject to regular physical attacks. Mary Smurl, Jack's mother, was afflicted with a depressive episode that was characterised by bouts of wailing anguish and deep, quiet sadness. Other bouts of inexplicable illnesses were frequent. They simply could not cope. For the second time, they decided that they would leave, to get away from the house for a few days and camp in the countryside. But the entity went with them. Ed Warren had warned the family that the demon would likely have the ability to travel with them, and he was right. Janet and Jack were sitting outside their camper van. All of the swimsuits and towels were drying in the sunshine on the clothesline. All of a sudden, All of the swimsuits, and only the swimsuits, were ripped off the line at once, all in one go. Janet and Jack had been told by the priest who performed the exorcism that they simply could not respond to the entity or give it attention. So they didn't. Later that evening, while Janet and the children went to a local dance, Jack sat by the fire. Simon, the family dog, lay content at his feet. Simon suddenly started and stood up and began to growl at the tree line. Jack looked up and blinked. There was a teenage girl standing in the tree line. She was in a colonial-style dress. She stood silently staring at Jack while Simon growled at her aggressively. Jack blinked again, hardly daring to take his eyes off her, and she was gone. She reappeared again a few minutes later, and Jack grabbed Simon and retreated into the camper. The holiday was then marred by the sounds of a girl in the distance frantically crying out for help, but no girl was ever found. Items began to move around the campsite of their own accord, and it seemed for the family that there really was no escape from this entity. It could, and would, follow them wherever they went, intent on wreaking havoc in their lives. A second exorcism was arranged. As you can imagine, this exorcism did not achieve the desired result, although the entity was quiet during the actual exorcism itself. The family initially believed that this was a sign that things were taking a turn for the better, that the entity was releasing its grasp on them. But they were wrong. The activity in the house was quiet for a day or two, and then it ramped right back up again. Janet saw a dark hooded figure in the bathroom, but also began to see a glowing entity that she later discerned to be female, that she felt meant her great harm. There were nights where the children were thrown from their beds, loud crashes and subsequent sobs filling the quiet of the night. Jack and Janet had a night where their mattress was repeatedly shaken and eventually levitated a foot into the air. It was relentless. And at this point, the Smurls decided that they had no other option but to take the Warrens' advice and take their story public. Perhaps it would lead to someone out there seeing their story and being able to help them. The Warrens had told them that there was no point in selling the house or moving, as the entity would just follow them. The Smurls appeared along with the Warrens on a television show to talk about their experiences, and as the Warrens warned, the entity was not happy about it. On the day of the television appearance, John and Mary Smurl had to leave the house. The banging was so loud and persistent. A few nights after they arrived home, Janet was awoken in the night by being levitated from the bed, around the room, and smashed repeatedly from wall to wall. At this time, she was screaming for Jack to wake her up, but she believed that he was in what the Warrens called a psychic sleep, a sleep that was induced by the entity so that he couldn't help her. Eventually she awoke again, this time next to Jack, and sobbed her heart out, terrified that this entity was going to kill her. Jack awoke a few nights later to a creature standing at the end of his bed. He described it as roughly 8 feet in height, and it stood on 2 legs, but had on top of its wide shoulders a furry head with blinding red eyes and a pig-like snout. Standing at the end of the bed, the creature slavered and slobbered, then clawed at the air with rake-like fingers, seeming to threaten Jack with evisceration. Even more repugnant than the shape of the creature's face was the slobbering noises of its lips, which resembled pieces of liver as they took in air and saliva. Jack's screaming woke Janet, but the creature was already gone. It wasn't the only incident where Jack would see a creature in the house. Another night, as he went to the bathroom, he was confronted with a huge monster on 2 legs that resembled horse legs. Its skull was somehow simultaneously human and animal-like and covered with dark fur. Jack sprinted back down the hallway with the creature in hot pursuit. He dove onto the bed, and the creature ran across the bed and through the wall. He couldn't wake Janet up. The family decided again that it was time to leave. All the Smurls, including John and Mary, needed to leave the house for a week to see how the entity would respond. They again went to a campsite where Mary Smurl reported rapping on the camper van while she was in bed. The bed she was laying in, which was nailed to the floor, was being shaken violently from side to side as if the entity was trying to rip it from the floor. The nights were permeated by the sounds of banging on the ceiling, hooves clattering across the roof. John Smurl was lifted from his bed when his mattress levitated. And Jack spotted the dark hooded figure watching their camper van one night, and he knew that wherever he went, this entity would follow. While they were away, their neighbour, who was unaware that the family were not at home, rang Janet to see if she wanted to go shopping. A little girl answered the phone, giggled and said, "They don't live here anymore." When the family returned, Jack Smurl was once again sexually assaulted in the night by the entity, and the family decided to contact their local paper. The outcome was catastrophic. The media circus was immediate. People were desperate to have a look at this house that was supposedly haunted. Neighbours had odours in their houses, rappings, and heard screaming emanating from the Smurl house. So the hauntings continued and seemed to be spreading. The family received letters from all over the world by the bagload. People also threatened them, and at points there were violent near misses. Both Janet and Jack lost substantial amounts of weight, and the stress caused Janet to develop a stomach ulcer. They had another exorcism, which seemed to help briefly, until Jack witnessed the cloaked figure again and the rappings started in the night. I would love to say that there is a satisfying end to this story, that there was a battle of good versus evil, that the priest strode through the house liberally splashing holy water and the demon retreated into the shadows. But there isn't a satisfying end to this story. Basically, the Smurl family moved house. And that is genuinely kind of it. Like, the story ends really abruptly. And just to remind you, all of the information in this episode comes from The Haunted by Robert Curran with Jack and Janet Smurl. And like I said, this book was written kind of immediately when this haunting was happening, etc., right? And one of the first things I wrote down was that, you know, there were rumours about this house for years and years and years. However, were there? And Robert Curran very honestly and openly put in the book that these rumours about the house, where people had called the police to the house multiple times because of screaming, blah, 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 there were actually no records of any police intervention in this house while it was empty, while the Smurls were there, outside of the kind of media circus that came with it. There wasn't any record of anybody calling the police to say there'd been screaming in this household. So I think personally that these big rumours about the house, I wonder if they were perpetuated after the Smurl haunting. So, you know, after the haunting happened, were people going, well, wasn't there stories about that house for years? As far as I'm aware, there is no reports of any weird shit happening in the house in subsequent families that have lived there. And I'm going to say, with my whole chest, that I think something happened to this family. I really do. I do not think that they made this story up in order to gain notoriety or fame. And I don't think they did that purposefully. Not at all. I think something happened to this family. I don't necessarily believe that it was fully paranormal, or that all of the events that took place were paranormal events. And I will explain why. As an aside, I did write down that I thought it was really interesting that Jack Smurl in his stint in the Navy worked in electric shock therapy, which is not what they call it nowadays, it's ECT. And I just found that interesting. And just to be clear, ECT is still used to this day. It's complex, it's controversial. It was widely used inappropriately for many, many years, but it is still in use to this day. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this case, which is completely omitted from this book, there is no mention of this in this book whatsoever, is that Jack Smurl told a newspaper reporter that he had had surgery to remove water from his brain in 1983 because he had been experiencing neurological difficulties due to a case of meningitis in his youth. So he'd had meningitis, his brain had never recovered. And part of this neurological difficulty was short-term memory loss. And there are suggestions online that Jack Smurl also hallucinated and had sleeping difficulties. Now, obviously, I am not a medical professional, so I can't say whether or not having water removed from your brain from a case of meningitis is something that would cause hallucinations and would therefore explain the things that Jack Smurl saw. But I do think it is very interesting that a lot of the experiences of Jack Smurl himself, as in the entities that he sees, so he sees the two women in his room, he sees these creatures, he sees at one point a man appears in his room and leans over him and says, "You're going to pay for this." He sees a lot. He levitates at night time. He is, paralyzed numerous times. I did wonder, as I was reading this, if a lot of these incidents that happened to Jack Smurl at night time were cases of sleep paralysis. And I would like to point out now, as I've said countless times, sleep paralysis sounds absolutely petrifying. And I do not dispute the fact that having sleep paralysis would have a serious impact on your mental health and your ability to sleep, right? But throughout this story, Jack Smurl is saying, I woke up, I realised I couldn't move, and then this thing was happening to me and I couldn't control it, and then suddenly I was able to move again and the demon, the entity, had left the room. And later in the story, Janet Smurl has similar experiences where she says, I woke up and I was screaming for Jack, but he couldn't hear me because he was in this psychic sleep, or I was screaming for Jack and no sound was coming out. And they do sound very characteristic of very basic sleep paralysis. That moment in the book where Janet Smurl says she's levitated out of the bed and she's literally smashed around the room, hurled around from one wall to the other. She's screaming for Jack. He's not waking up, and that he's in this, what they call a psychic sleep, because the entity is keeping the other person asleep. And then she wakes up suddenly beside Jack. And a lot of this information about what is going on seems to be coming directly from Ed Warren. That Ed Warren is saying, this is happening because the other person's in a psychic sleep and that's why they can't hear you, that's why they can't see you. And I did find it interesting that nowhere in the book did anyone mention possibly that this could be sleep paralysis. And this book was written by a journalist, and but there was no kind of attempt to offer alternate explanations as to what was going on in this household. And like I said, I do think strange things were happening, but I don't necessarily think that all of those strange things were paranormal. And I think if you're a journalist writing about stuff like this, it's important to weigh up other possibilities. Now, granted, this is the 80s. We didn't, know as much about mental health conditions, etc., or, sleep disturbances, parasomnia, whatever, in the 1980s. But I do think there are elements of this that just don't seem paranormal to me. Now, is it freaky that the neighbours are hearing screaming in the house? That the neighbours are hearing this sound of that sounds like the fluttering of giant wings? The girls are hearing that in the house? That somebody rings the phone and this fucking demon little girl answers? All of that is scary as shit. Please do not get me wrong. But there is fundamentally something about these nocturnal visions that I find quite difficult. And I am going to talk about sex for a minute. Okay, so if that does not sound like your thing, then skip forward. I am going to talk briefly about Jack Smurl being assaulted by this succubus in the night. So again, if you're going to find that difficult, I would suggest that you skip forward about 5 minutes. There are frequent references to sex and rape in this book that I found very difficult very early on. Like I said, I was like, why did I not cover this story before? And then as I read on in the book, I was like, oh yes, this is why. So I don't talk about incubus or succubus stories on the podcast. I have talked about them on Patreon in an episode where I talked about the demon Lilith and her, you know, where the ideas around succubus and incubus stories came from, right? And I have had succubus and incubus stories sent into the podcast, but they always tend to be quite gratuitously sexual, and I would find that very difficult to discuss. But very, very early on in this story, there is a reference to Janet feeling like she was being watched in the house. And there is a comparison made between Janet feeling like she's being watched and the feeling of being raped. And it is that comparison is made, I mean, that explicitly. And I thought, oh, that's a very, very big comparison to make. And I don't think that it is a fair thing to say that the feeling of being watched in your home is akin to the feeling of being raped. I could imagine that it's a similar feeling, you know, that you feel violated or that you feel unsafe and all of those things. But I thought that's a very big comparison to make. There is also an element to the story where one of the daughters, Dawn, is in the shower and she feels her arms being squeezed, and then that is referred to as Dawn almost being raped by this entity in the shower. She is in the shower having a normal shower. She says she feels that there is suddenly a male presence in the shower. She feels her arms being squeezed, like both her arms at the same time, like something is holding her, and then it lets go. And the author then refers to that as her almost being raped by this entity. And again, I thought, oh, this is getting very complicated. And there are lots of moments that are just sort of overtly, almost unnecessarily sexual. Like, for example, there's a bit where John and Mary Smurl, as in the grandparents, Jack's parents, are getting ready to go to bed, and the demon says something like, don't you think I look sexy? And it all just felt a bit bizarre. But maybe that was literally what was going on for them. Do you know what I mean? Maybe that was genuinely how they felt about it. And maybe that was whatever this entity's way of keeping them on their toes, as it were, and kind of discombobulating them by doing these really strange, bizarre things. And I do recognise and understand that these kind of extreme comparisons to sexual assault may have been, again, the power of hindsight, that suddenly, in light of Jack Smurl's experiences with what he believed to be a succubus, then suddenly other experiences felt different and felt maybe more threatening, more sexual, etc. And maybe that was just the writer's way of setting you up for kind of how the family felt violated in numerous ways within this house. The description of Jack's experiences with this succubus are incredibly detailed, both experiences. And I will be honest, like, there's elements of it that I found kind of absurdly funny, where it felt like his experiences kind of needed more exploration, conversation, questions, etc. And I could sit here and make jokes about the things that he said and kind of take the piss out of his experience, but I also don't want to sit here and take the piss out of somebody saying, you know, I was raped and it has irrevocably changed my life. You know what I mean? I don't want to sit here and take the piss out of that. So I'm not going to. Perhaps it was just written in a way that kind of, they didn't give much thought about a serious portrayal of what happened to this man. Whether it was he was genuinely visited by a demonic succubus, or whether this was a version of sleep paralysis. What this man experienced must have been deeply traumatic. And this is why I've never covered this story before, because it is very complicated to talk about. And just to be clear as well, right, I am not taking this less seriously because it is a man who experienced it, right? And I can assure you of that. But I do think it is written in a way that does not properly lend itself to eyebrows not being raised when you are reading it. To give you an example of what I mean by this, there are numerous moments where they reiterate the fact that despite this entity being this terrifying, obviously demonic entity, it did have had a great body, a great firm body, and also reinforced and reiterated the fact that this entity had multiple orgasms while this was occurring. So, so I do think that Jack Smurl had a horrific time and obviously had horrific experiences in this house. Like I said, that must have deeply traumatized him. I do also think that maybe those experiences could have had a bit of editorial input in terms of how they were presented. Okay, so the sex bit is over and we're going to move on before I get myself cancelled. And I do think that in this book, you can kind of see, in my opinion, how the Warrens really influenced these families. For example, before they go on holidays, Ed Warren's like, well, the thing's probably going to follow you. And if that feels like priming, you know what I mean? That you're saying to the family, well, it's going to follow you. So anything then that happens on holiday, or the family are already on edge when they go on holiday and they feel like shit, God, it's going to follow us anyway, and things are going to be bad. Also things like, well, it's good now after the exorcism, but actually it's only the calm before the storm. Things will just get worse. And maybe that's just my big opinions about the Warrens coming through. But I'm always reminded of that quote where it's like, Ed Warren has never been in a house that wasn't haunted. There is also a bit in the book which I found very tricky, which is when they are being interviewed on the television. So Ed Warren and Lorraine, they go on to this chat show with the Smurls, and they're talking about their work and the household and what's going on for them. And at one point, apparently the host of the show says, do you worry about the devil? Do you worry about all of the demonic entities that you have fought? And Ed Warren says about Satan, he says, he knows who we are. And I just thought, mate, do you think Satan, if he exists, is down there worrying about you? Like, there's something very I am the center of the universe about that statement. I also think, it's important to recognize that it is necessary within these stories to take what is said, especially when it comes to the Warrens, with a pinch of salt, unfortunately. If you are unsure of what I mean by that, genuinely just look up the background to the Amityville haunting story. But in this book, in this recounting of what happened, there is a lot of also speaking in absolutes, which I think is probably really unhelpful if somebody believes a demon is in their house. So first of all, these people arrive, this family's life has been turned upside down. These people arrive and go, there's 4 entities, there's an older woman, there's a man, there's a woman who's insane and really dangerous and violent, and there's a demon. Like, that's speaking in absolutes. Suddenly this family are like, there's a fucking demon in our house. And then they're talking about these demons and saying, well, the demon did this, so that means that's what its intention is. Or they're giving like a backstory to how this demon got there. And the backstory kind of varies depending on where we are in the story. At one point it's like, oh, this horrific murder happened on this property and therefore this demon has been lying in wait for years. And at other points they're like, oh, something is buried, something pagan is buried underneath this house. And you just think, stop speaking in absolutes. And there is a reference in this, which I wonder if it's where that came from. There's a reference to 3 knocks being the mocking of the Holy Trinity. And so help me God, if Ed Warren is the orchestrator of that mythology, that 3 knocks, 3 anything, is the sign of a mocking of the Holy Trinity, of, you know, the Father, Son and the Holy Spirit. Well, I want to know how he has that information, or how anybody has that information. Is this the first reference of it in literature? Because I've spoken about this before, how I never understood where this came from, this idea that 3 anything is the mocking of the Holy Trinity. I have never understood where that came from. Is it from Ed Warren? I'm going to have to do a deep dive and try and figure that out, because it's one of those questions that just annoys me in general in the world of the paranormal community. I'm like, where was this myth perpetuated that 3 knocks means the mocking of the Holy Trinity, or 3 scratches, or 3 whatever means the mocking of the Holy Trinity? I want to know. And even though I made notes and points about this story, I am still rambling. It is my opinion that weird things happened in that house. I don't know how those weird things happened. I believe this family fundamentally went through something, but I do think there are elements of this story that are fundamentally not paranormal, that are presented as being these crazy paranormal experiences that possibly just aren't. I think there are strange things that happened in this household, but I do think that mixed up within that there are indicators that there are mental health issues within the household, that there are, like I said, parasomnia issues. I wondered as well about why, when all this activity was happening, and it was, aggressive activity, we are having kids hurled out of beds and people being flung against walls, and stuff that is happening that would change the face of the world, change our understanding of the world as we know it, if people could see it. That baffles me as to why the Warrens did not set up video cameras. I mean, it was the 80s, you know what I mean? Why were there not video cameras set up in this house? There are entities, creatures, monsters roaming this house. And I am a firm believer that it is a boring point to make, to be like, well, why didn't you take a picture? Why didn't you take your phone out? I have lived in a house for the last year where strange things have happened, and I can tell you that not once have I thought to myself, I better get my phone out and record this. It just doesn't really happen in the moment. However, if you were Ed and Lorraine Warren and you were confronted with this phenomena this is off the wall, this is like, stuff is happening in this house that is just unfathomable, why would you not set up cameras? I also think it is very interesting that the Warrens encouraged the family to go public with their story. And I also think it's interesting that they encouraged the family not to leave the house. They said, if you leave, this entity will follow you. There's no point, etc., etc. And I also think it's interesting that almost immediately they encouraged the family with this reporter to write this book. And Ed and Lorraine Warren contribute throughout the chapters in this book. I think it is very interesting that it seems there was money to be made from this story. I do, however, think that at the centre of this, there was a family that was going through some sort of crisis, whether it was paranormal, emotional, psychological, whether it was spiritual. I don't know. Maybe it was a mix of all of the above. I do not believe that what they needed in this instance was a media circus. Fundamentally, I don't think that was something that they needed or was helpful to them. Well, that was intense, wasn't it? Thank you for listening to today's episode and my rambling thoughts about today's episode. Oh God, yeah, that was a slog. I will say getting through that book was a slog. I found it very difficult to read for myriad reasons. And you kind of end up with these stories where you're just listing events, listing the activity. And it's hard to escape that kind of listing narrative. But there we go. That is the story of the Smurl family. I did also, when I was reading about this story and kind of deep diving, there were people on Reddit, and obviously take everything on Reddit with a grain of salt, much like take everything that the Warrens say with a grain of salt. There were people on Reddit who were commenting, being like, yeah, I worked with you know, one of the Smurl children, whichever daughter, and weird things happen in the house and they just want to forget about it and move on. And it must be really difficult to be in that situation as a child where all of these terrifying things are happening around you, and to see the adults in your life living in perpetual fear must be absolutely awful. It must be horrendous. And I'm going to have to stop now, because if I keep talking about this story, I'll never stop talking about it. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you have a story, I promise it does not have to be as intense as the Smurl family haunting, but if you have a story, you can email it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.